They didn't have a race caller because the local publican decided he'd have a go. And after 2 or 3 races, he was just making such a mess of it that he virtually got booed out of the broadcast box. And a few of the drunken locals decided to have a go, and they were just as bad. So the race club said, oh, we've got to try and do something a bit better here. So asked around, made a few phone calls, and, realised there were a couple of young guys in Melbourne that were looking for an opportunity. And I got the gig. I think I was 17, and I flew to Poonkerry. Never heard of the place before, and I've never been back there since, but that was my first chance. Here we are now, as you say, 25 years on after calling 5 Melbourne Cups. But it's always just that getting that first break is always the hardest.
This is Legends with Bevo, thanks to Bet Odyssey, Renelec Electrical Services, and Anytime Fitness Glenelg. And now, here's your host, Bevo.
Matt Hill, welcome to Legends with Bevo. Great to have you on the show, mate.
Bevo, absolutely fantastic. I'm just a little bit envious that I couldn't have a set behind me that is so good like yours. It's absolutely tremendous where you are, but lovely to have a chat. Looking forward to it.
I do feel like a bit of a younger version of Mike Sheehan, although I shouldn't really say that because he's miles ahead of me in terms of his experience, but it's a pretty good setup here for sure.
Oh, absolutely. The only thing is, it would have been good to sit in the studio with you, but we're in different states. Your seats look very comfortable there.
Yes, very much so. Well, hopefully one day, post-COVID, we can get to meet in person and have a proper chat.
I look forward to that.
All right, we'll get things started now. Segment number 1, mate. This one is called What Were You Thinking? Now, you've called your 5th Melbourne Cup this year, which you obviously do a wonderful job of that. Everyone knows the voice of Matt Hill. Plus, you've been involved as a broadcaster for 20 plus years. You've called the Australian Open, you've called the AFL, the Caulfield Cup, 5 Olympics, the Cox Plate, the list goes on. Mate, tell us about when you sort of first started. Was there someone on TV that sort of gave you an inspiration to be a commentator, or where did you sort of get that real love for wanting to be a commentator? And did it sort of come from being a young fella?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I was obsessed when I was probably 7 or 8 years of age, to be honest. And I think I'm probably one of the last generation. I mean, I'm 40. So a lot of the younger guys now that are in their, sort of teens or early 20s, they're taking a lot in via television, and there's a lot of sport on television now. So it's very hard for a commentator to really break through. Whereas when I was a young guy, there was only really 3 or 4 television stations. There was no such thing as pay TV, and there was the radio. So I sound like I'm talking like an old man, but it was still in like the 80s, early 90s. So listening to the radio was the real key for me. And I mean, it was an absolute must on a Sunday to watch Sports World on Channel 7, and you'd have Bruce McAvaney there interviewing all of the key protagonists, and then he'd do the football panel, and then he'd go off and call the football, and then the week after he'd be hosting from the Australian Open, and then the week after he'd be at Bathurst Motor Racing. And I thought, gee, what a great job that would be. And also with the racing, I'd go to the races with my granddad at Flemington, and I'd hear Greg Miles's voice over the PA. And what I loved about that was every time Greg said something, the crowd would react. The crowd would sort of go, yes, if he said their horse was coming into the race, or if the horse was struggling. So I just wanted to have that job. I was sort of really inspired to do it. So I got the racing bug, and, racing people will tell you once you get the racing bug, it's impossible to get rid of it. So I basically wanted to be Greg Miles. I wanted to be the race caller at Flemington, and I wanted to call sport. I wanted to be Bruce McAvaney. So when a lot of young guys, they were looking at supermodels, or they had footballers on their bedroom walls, I wanted to be Greg Miles and Bruce McAvaney.
All right, mate, this segment is called The Man with the $1 Million Voice. Now, as I mentioned before, you've called the 5 Melbourne Cups, you've done the Olympic Games, you did a wonderful job in Tokyo this year, you've been involved in broadcasting for 20 plus years. What sort of preparation is involved, though, with calling the race that stops the nation and calling the sport? Sort of what do you do, and do you follow, say, someone like a Bruce that you mentioned before, who was your idol growing up?
Well, the preparation is the absolute key to it, really. The Melbourne Cup, it feels like the build-up goes from about July, because there are horses qualifying for the Melbourne Cup as early as May, actually, in the Andrew Ramsden at Flemington. So we're always talking about the Melbourne Cup, but the real preparation for a race caller is about 10 minutes before a race, because it's a photographic memory. And a great race caller by the name of Joe Brown used to work at the ABC, and he said that we've probably got bad memories because we learn the colours, but then we have to sift them out and get rid of that set of colours for the next race. So we have a very strange job in that someone like Bruce McAvaney, if you want to use an example like Bruce or Dennis Cometti, calls the AFL, they call the grand final, and then they don't have anything else to worry about. Whereas on Melbourne Cup Day, we have 10 races and we have to call 6 races first before we get to, the grand final being the Melbourne Cup. And then once we've climbed that mountain, we've got 3 races to go after that. So the preparation for the day is actually really quite a key, because by the time you get to the racetrack, you need to be ready for everything. You have to expect the unexpected. So if you are calling a race like the Melbourne Cup, where the last 200 metres of the Cup is replayed over and over and over again on the news and on radio replays, for instance, you want to get that right. So you sort of need to be pre-prepared for every moment that could happen. So the lead up to Cup Week is usually pretty busy, and to be honest, it's not much glamour to it, Bevo, to be honest. I sit in the office and I just look through all of the races and write my notes and look through past results and then just try and work out all the narratives that could happen on Melbourne Cup Day. And as far as learning the colours are concerned, I've got to that stage where they stick in the head pretty well. And then on the day, about 10 minutes before each race, when the jockeys mount the horses, I solidify them in my brain again.
When did you actually call your first race as well, Matty? How old were you?
I would have been, I think I was 16.
Oh, wow.
And it was a 2-horse race at Healesville, over 1,600 metres. I couldn't tell you who won the race, but the hardest gig I think I ever got, Bevo, and you would understand this being in media, and I'm sure a lot of media people would understand this, as young people, the hardest job to get was your first one, because I'd ring up a race club. I'd first of all double check in the racing calendar where the race courses were, and then I'd say to my mum, where's a place like Bairnsdale? How far away is that? Could you drive me there if I get a gig, And then I'd talk to the person from the Bairnsdale Jockey Club or the Merton Jockey Club and say, could you have a race caller, a young race caller possibly? And they'd say, well, how much experience have you had? And of course I'd had none. So, someone had to take a risk somewhere along the line. I ended up getting a few little jobs here and there and calling trials. And so I called a 2-horse race at Healesville. And then the first meeting I ever called was at a place called Poon Kerry, which is above the border. It's about an hour and a half drive from Mildura, but it's in New South Wales. And I think the town population is about 800 people, but they get about 3,000 to the race meeting. And it's a dusty dirt track. And the year before I got asked to go, they didn't have a race caller because the local publican decided he'd have a go. And after 2 or 3 races, he was just making such a mess of it that he virtually got booed out of the broadcast box, and a few of the drunken locals decided to have a go, and they were just as bad. So the race club said, we've got to try and do something a bit better here. So asked around, made a few phone calls, and, realised there were a couple of young guys in Melbourne that were looking for an opportunity. And I got the gig. I think I was 17, and I flew to Poon Kerry. Never heard of the place before, and I've never been back there since, but that was my first chance. Here we are now, as you say, 25 years on after calling 5 Melbourne Cups. But it's always just that getting that first break is always the hardest.
Yeah, and also I spoke to Terry McAuliffe recently, another brilliant race caller, I'm sure you know, from racing.com.
Yes.
And I sort of admire you guys because it just must be so hard to, because I personally think that you guys must speak really fast, but then Terry's like, no, you don't speak fast. It's just like you look at the horse's colours and then you just memorise the horse. But when there's like, 24 or generally 24 horses in a Melbourne Cup, that's a lot of horses to remember, Matty.
Oh, no doubt. I mean, the thing is, what most race callers that have called the Melbourne Cup will tell you is that it's actually not the field size that is the worry. We go to the races quite often, and Terry would have, admitted that as well, that the days of calling the races at Morfordville, for instance, for him, he would have called fields of up to 18 horses. So it's really the gravity of the Melbourne Cup that makes it the race that it is, really. We see a lot of the horses prior anyway, because half of them run in the Caulfield Cup. But it's more so the fact that I think that there's some... Look, I've heard so many numbers, Bevo, but it'd be like 10 million. 10 million people listen to the Melbourne Cup, and it's now goes around the world. So, that's the one race every year of the 1,200 races, 1,500 races that I do, that you want to get right. And you want to get it right for you, but you also want to do the race justice.
That must make you pretty damn proud to know that there's that many people listening to your voice.
Yeah. Well, proud and nervous as well.
Now, the next segment, Matty, this one is called Still Makes Me Smile. Yep. Looking back now at your life, we mentioned it before, 20 plus years as a broadcaster. This is a really hard one to answer because you'd have so many memories to look back on. But what would be your ultimate sort of career memory so far from your career, and why?
Oh, gee, that's a good one. That is a hard one to answer.
Well, you can say maybe a few of your favourites then.
Yeah, well, race callers have a funny job because we're a little bit like the Wimbledon ball kids. The less annoying you can be to the viewer, the better. So as a result, there are probably some races that I do. I could go and call a maiden race at, Bendigo on a Wednesday and get really, quite satisfied by the job I've done, compared to calling a Cox Plate or a Melbourne Cup. So we're funny beasts, race callers. But for mine, I think the one moment that I was privileged to call, which it goes down as one of the great Olympic moments, was Mo Farah winning the 5 and 10,000 double in London, which was virtually the London Olympics version of the Kathy Freeman moment. Everyone in England was stopped to listen or watch that race at the London Olympic Stadium. It was one of the great races of all time. So I think Mo, particularly winning the second of the races over the 5,000 metres, it'd have to be in the top 5 Olympic moments of all time. So I had the privilege of calling that race for Australian radio. So I think that goes down as probably the number one. But then looking at Vow and Declare's Melbourne Cup in 2019, it was the build up to it. We had 24 runners. One of them was an Australian bred horse trained by an Australian, ridden by an Australian in Craig Williams, who I'd followed since a young boy. I actually remember standing over the fence at Flemington when I was 15, getting Craig Williams' autograph. And at some, 25 years on, I'm quite pally with Craig, and for him to win the Melbourne Cup, the one race that he hadn't won, and to call that race in such an insane finish with 4 or 5 horses across the track, that'll probably go down as one of my favourites. And then obviously to call Winks, one of our greatest horses of all time, winning 4 Cox Plates. I was absolutely blessed that when Greg Miles announced his retirement, that the first Cox Plate I was to call was her attempt at winning a 3rd Cox Plate and match Kingston Town. So I got very, very lucky. So there's 3 moments. But as I say, I'm one of those guys that I could go and call a qualifying match for the Australian Open between the number 240 in the world and number 470 in the world and still get great satisfaction of doing what I do. So, yeah, it's nice to do the big ones, and sometimes it's nice to do the small jobs too.
Well, I can relate to that a little bit, mate. Not to sort of your level, but I've been calling a bit of basketball and footy this year, and just really enjoying it. And obviously, it's a challenge, and especially calling footy, it's one of the hardest things you can do. Not quite as hard as horse racing, but yeah, just calling that play by play, and it's very difficult. Yep. So I've definitely got admiration.
Well,
for
you say that about football, which is interesting because I've been doing some football myself this year, and I'm like you. I love the adrenaline rush of calling the football, but don't worry, it's a fast game. It's a lot faster than what it used to be 20 years ago. And as opposed to being a race broadcaster, you've got 20 blokes out there that all look the same. They're all wearing the same thing. When there's 24 in the Melbourne Cup, at least they're wearing something different. So, it isn't the easiest task.
That's definitely true. Now, this next segment, Matt, is called moments I'd rather forget. So 20 plus years as a broadcaster, mentioned before, thousands of races that you've called in terms of horse racing, the Olympics, the list goes on. Tell us about a couple of your most embarrassing moments or awkward moments in the commentary box and why.
Well, career-wise, there was one that I'd prefer to forget for quite a serious reason. Part of my, well, if you like to say, Olympic journey was the first time I went to the Olympics in Beijing for Australian radio, and I got very, very ill. In fact, I nearly died. I contracted a disease called melioidosis, which I got through the air. You get it through dust particles or through the air. And I'd been calling the rowing. I'd been a part of the team for just on a week. In the latter part of that first week, I was starting to feel horrendous, and I ended up being air-vaced out of China and ended up in intensive care in Hong Kong. So it was touch and go there for a time, for quite a time. I survived. I've survived and here to tell the tale. So that was probably something that, I don't know if I'd want to forget it though. I mean, I think you sort of get to the stage in life where you're quite grateful. And I think to survive that and to be here to tell the tale, it's just one of those life experiences. But that was something that we'll never forget. As far as broadcasting experiences, I'll never forget one day at Newcastle, and there was a field of 8. And not exactly a complicated race to call, I wouldn't have thought, but a horse was 5 lengths in front and I couldn't remember the thing's name. Could not remember it. And I started and stammered and I racked my brain. And as the horse hit the line, in fact, the worst thing what I tried to do is I realised that I'd forgotten the horse's name. So I dived for the binoculars and tried to find its number on the side of its body, and the wind was flapping the number so much that I couldn't tell the number either. So it was the worst. It was the race caller's worst nightmare. And I got the horse's name right on the line. So it wasn't a complete disaster, but it was 95% a disaster and felt like an absolute fool. But it can happen. It's the race caller's worst nightmare, a mental block, and every single race caller, I can guarantee it, has had one. And all of us, and I don't know, I thought I was the only one until I started asking some of the local race callers and even race callers overseas. We all have a recurring dream, I reckon once every 3 months, where we're dreaming about forgetting a horse's name. So I don't know what on earth we're doing to our brain cells when we do this job, but I'd have a dream probably once every 2 or 3 months where I've got to the broadcast box and I've forgotten a horse's name and it's raced away and won. It's our worst nightmare.
Well, it can't be as bad as what happened to Jimmy Jakes a couple of years ago when his voice just went completely on him, and I felt so sorry for the guy.
Yeah. Well, the thing was, we were all sort of, instead of cheering for the horses, we all started cheering for Jimmy, didn't we? When he got to the 200-metre mark, we thought, come on, mate, you can get through it. But isn't it amazing that some of these things, I remember there's a great greyhound caller here in Melbourne named Paul Hammond. He's called thousands of races over 30 years, and he's travelled Victoria calling greyhound races. And he called a greyhound race one night at Cranbourne where it was fog. You couldn't see the dogs. It was just completely fogged in. And his commentary made the news that night. And he said, isn't that remarkable? I've called that many races over the time, and the one race where you can't see the greyhounds made the news. So the funny things that happen over the time.
Now, this next segment is called Big Failures and What You've Learnt. Now, do you remember the first big fail you experienced, Matt? How that made you feel, and sort of how'd you get past those failures?
Well, I reckon the first time I was calling some greyhounds in my local area here when I was about 16, and I was given an opportunity to call some greyhound races. And I think my performance over the public address was pretty ordinary. And I remember the next day, sitting in the kitchen talking to my mum, thinking that, maybe this job isn't for me. And I think you just have to be resilient. I think you have to work on some self-assurance. I knew in my blood that I could do the job, and I think I spurred myself on that way. So I think if you can learn, you acknowledge what has happened, acknowledge the mistakes you've made, and then work on it. And Rome wasn't built in a day. That's the one thing I think people, in particular in media, tend to think that jobs just happen like that. I think if you're prepared to work your butt off, things will happen, but it's not going to happen tomorrow. It's going to happen in the future. And you were talking about calling basketball and football before. I'm sure you'll keep working on it, and you'll absolutely get to the stage where it's second nature for you. And I think that's what you've got to do. It's all about resilience, really. The big I think the other thing about failure is that you've got to be ready to fail. You don't want to be scared of failure. I think we have to fail. In fact, I heard a great expression the other day: if you want the rainbow, you have to be able to put up with the rain. And I think even though that's a highly philosophical expression, I think it's true. I think no successful person in the world has done it by just pure luck or by getting a lovely run. You have to just work hard and take the knocks and get over the next hurdle, even if you have to do it how the 110 hurdlers do it at the Olympics. If you knock a few over on the way through and it's not that pretty, just keep going.
I remember calling hockey once, and I had absolutely no idea what I was doing, and I've only done it once, and that's fine because it probably wasn't for me. But I was thinking afterwards, like, that was probably one of the worst calls I've ever done. But it's one of those things where, hey, I gave it a go, and I thought, well, okay, I can't call hockey, but I can call swimming, I can call footy, I can call basketball. So there's other options as well. So.
Oh, of course, and that's the one thing too. I mean, the sports commentary is interesting because I've always thought you have to love the sport you're calling, really. You have to have a love for it. Otherwise, it's probably not for you. And I mean, I've been asked previously to call some sports, and I've just said, look, they're just not my sports, like cricket, rugby league. I quite enjoy watching them on TV, but I don't have the passion or the drive to want to call them. So I wouldn't be doing them justice. But, so I think you've just got to do what makes your heart sing, really. That's the best thing. And if you keep doing that, following what your heart tells you, you won't go wrong.
That is actually great advice, and you're so right. You want to be calling something that you're passionate about, because otherwise you can tell in the call that even if you watch things and you can tell people that don't want to be there, and in interviews, whatever it might be, and it just sounds really bad. But if you're actually passionate for something and you prepare, you do your research like you mentioned before, then it just comes across so much better. So.
Well, for me, calling horse races or calling the football, I want to be there. I absolutely love it. So as a result, you're feeling the events. The event means just as much to you as the actual call. So for me, calling the Melbourne Cup, I'm that fascinated by who's going to win it. I'm so involved in it that making a mistake or getting nervous sort of doesn't even enter the equation. And, talking about a guy like Bruce McAvaney, I could talk about Bruce all day and I probably will, but a guy like Bruce, he called the Tokyo Olympics. You could tell that everything he was doing with the athletics, he was feeling it. He loves it so much. He was fascinated by it. And that's what makes great callers. And Dennis Cometti, when he was calling the football, he was so connected to it. So, yeah, you've just got to follow, what you really believe in. And I think when I've come across young commentators or people in university who want to be commentators, the first thing I say is, find a sport that you really want to do. And it doesn't matter if it's volleyball or if it's, mini golf, whatever it is, just love it and the rest will come.
I love that. That's great advice. Now, this next segment, Matt, this one is called Starstruck Celebrities, one of my favourites, this one. So you met some famous people in your time. Who's been the most famous, though, and who really left you starstruck and why?
Starstruck, well, it'd have to be a sportsman. For me, Rafael Nadal. I did an interview with him. He had one of those pre-Australian Open nights where he addressed a group of fans, adoring fans, and they'd paid good money to hear him speak. They asked me to just MC the hour or two that he'd be up there, and that was unbelievable because I'd never actually stood next to Rafa. The first thing that I couldn't believe is how tall he was. He's deceptively tall, I must say, but a very, very nice man. And also the fact that his English isn't that strong. So to interview him was quite tough as well. But the people loved him. And for me, I thought, I didn't think that many people would sort of knocked me off my balance, if that makes sense. But talking to someone so famous like him really did. I thought he was fantastic, and I really enjoyed that. But as far as Starstruck, I don't know, there'd be too many along the journey. Yeah, I'll go with Rafael Nadal. I think he'd be one of the most global, sports stars that I've met. So I'll go with him.
I can understand that. I think I'd be a bit lost for words as well if I interviewed Rafa.
Yeah. Well, as I say, it was also it was a strange environment because all the fans just wanted to know stuff about Rafa, and of course, we all know his achievements, but also the fact that he was trying to crack a few jokes, and it's very difficult for these guys that can't speak. It's very hard to crack a joke in a language that you're not that fluent in. So he felt a bit uncomfortable, and I'm just standing there delighted that I'm standing next to Rafael Nadal. So it was a memorable hour. But for me, that was probably the time that I was a little bit starstruck by someone.
And this next segment, Matt, is called Words of Wisdom. Now, you've touched on it before. You mentioned Bruce, you mentioned Dennis, but who have been some of your real influences throughout your career, and why?
Well, I've had many. I think sports commentary is a little bit like musicians. When you look up a musician or a band, and they'll have on their Wikipedia page, the influences that they've had, because they've heard things and they've liked to sample that in their music. Well, I'm very similar. Race callers are very similar. We have almost like a language where I can sometimes sit here at night and just listen to the English races and listen to some commentaries and hear, I like that expression. I might use that at some point, and you have it under your sleeve for the next time you go out and perform. So for me, with the race calling, obviously Greg Miles, I adored when I was a young guy listening over the public address. At that time, a guy called Dan Malecki was calling the races on Channel 10, and he's now the voice of harness racing here in Melbourne. And I've always really listened to him, and he's been a great influence for me. I used to practice in a spare box at Moonee Valley, my misspent youth, on a Saturday night, just locking myself into a spare box at Moonee Valley, calling into a little tape recorder, and he was always there calling the races. So I'd ask him for advice, and I still do, which is a really nice thing 25 years on. A guy called Jim McGrath in England, an expat Australian who I still think had the best voice of any race caller I've ever heard, worked for the BBC over there. He was a guy that I just loved listening to and modelled myself on. And as I mentioned, Bruce McAvaney, I used to sit in my lounge room and just pretend that I was hosting Sports World. I just wanted to be Bruce, pretend I was hosting the Masters golf and all that sort of stuff, and call the football. I absolutely loved it. So they were sort of the guys that I wanted to be. And it's really nice, at least probably something a bit different away from the musicians, which I started with. A lot of musicians probably come along and never get to meet their idols or work with their idols. I've had that great opportunity to meet mine and work with them and get advice from them. So for that, I'm very grateful.
And before we let you go, we've got a mutual love for the late, great Darrell Lake. I have to get you to do your best Darrell impersonation before we go.
Well, I remember, I can sort of tell the viewers that when you talked to me about loving Darrell Lake, the first thing that came to my mind was, it's huge, And of course, Darrell was in that period in the 90s that I spoke about earlier, where you turn on Channel 9 Wide World of Sports, and it didn't matter what sport it was, if it was surf life-saving or people jumping off mountains or whatever it was Darrell calling the action. But of course, it was the weightlifting that really propelled Darrell into the stratosphere. He made what I would say a technical sport, but not the most exciting sport to watch, into just this remarkable event. And everyone, especially the Commonwealth Games in Melbourne in 2002, when Darrell Lake made a return to the microphone, it was an absolute joy. And I think for Darrell Lake supporters, or even people that loved the TV broadcasting in the 90s and even before that, the 80s, to sit there and watch Wide World of Sports on a Saturday with Ken Sutcliffe and Max Walker, and there was Darrell Lake calling every silly and wonderful sport. He brought them to life, and that was fundamentally what Darrell Lake's, he was a masterclass of a broadcaster, because he brought things to life. And in a similar vein, a guy like Ray Warren, who is the voice of rugby league, he was told that, he's going to call some swimming for Channel 9 in the 80s. And I don't think Ray at the time was sort of over the au fait with swimming, and all of a sudden he turned that sport into his own and brought the sport to life. So you can only dream of doing that as a broadcaster. So someone like Darrell Lake, hats off to him. He was just a master.
You've said it so well. He could call underwater knitting, he could call synchronised swimming, and just make it so much fun because of his personality.
Well, I think back in those days, Bevo, I think he did call underwater knitting. I think that's the sort of stuff they used to show on Wide World of Sports. And there was the one that sort of comes to mind is the Birdman rally type stuff where they used to jump into the ice cold water at Thredbo and they'd all dress up in silly outfits, and Darrell Lake could call it. It was madness, but it was the only thing on TV at the time, so we watched it.
Yeah, I'm with you. They were the best days. The Nines Wild World of Sports and the 12th man taking the mickey out of them. They were the greatest days.
Well, I've always wondered about that. Like, that was in a day where the cricket commentators famously had a job for life, because of Kerry Packer's support. But I do really think those guys like Tony Gregg and Bill Laurie and of course Richie, they became even more living legends because of the 12th man. I think I don't think Richie was overly that happy with the 12th man, but I think deep down they knew that they became absolute icons because of Billy Birmingham's work.
I think you're right. And thanks so much, Matty. It's been a marvellous chat today.
Oh, you do it well. Yeah, I'm not a great one at impressions, but terrific to be here. He's a Victorian. I'm a Victorian. I just want to book him. Yeah. Billy Laurie, fantastic. Good on you.
I love it. Hey, Matt Hill, thanks so much for joining us on Legends with Bevo today. This has been an absolute blast, and hopefully, like I mentioned before, we get to catch up for a beer and catch up in person.
Oh, I'd love it. And look at those seats in your studio. They look that comfortable. I look forward to doing it in person one day. Thanks for having me.
That would be fantastic. You take care and keep up the great work.
Good on you, Bevo.